Fab. Okay. Well, yeah, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Leeds Civic Trust for the first in a little mini series that we're doing of webinars about renewable energy technologies. And we're going to be delving into electric vehicles today. I know a lot of you, I can see on my screen, but in case you don't know me, my name's Anna and I'm the Planning and Transport Officer here at Leeds Civic Trust. A bit of housekeeping before we kick off. I just wanted to make you aware that we're recording today's session. That's because we want to upload it onto YouTube afterwards so we can sort of reach the wider membership. In terms of the format for today, we're going to have a 20-minute presentation from our lovely expert Christian, who's going to talk about electric vehicles. And then we'll have 15 minutes for questions before the session closes at 5:20 sharp, because we've got the planning committee at 5:30. So if I could ask you all to keep your microphones muted during the session until the questions at 5:05. During the Q&A, please raise your hand. You can either do that using the Zoom function or give me a wave, and I'll do my best to get to everyone. You can also pop your questions in the chat as Christian speaks as well. Without further ado, Christian, do you want to introduce yourself and share your screen and go for it?
Sure. Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you, everyone in the Leeds Civic Trust for the invitation. A pleasure to talk to you today. I'll be talking, just a little bit about myself. I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Energy Policy in the University of Strathclyde. I've been here for 7 years now. We're based on Glasgow, of course. And I have been in Leeds once, so lovely city. I'd love to go back. Thank you again for having me. On the center, we do work around different areas all over net zero. Transport is one of them, and we have done a few projects on electric vehicles. But we also look at heat pumps. We look at industrial decarbonisation. We look at jobs and skills and renewables, hydrogen, other areas as well. So I'm happy to take the discussion to other subjects as well in the future if anyone's interested. Anyway, I'm going to share my screen now, if that's okay, if I can find my slides. Yes. And I guess I'll give it a start. Just to highlight as well, yes, the main focus today is electric vehicles, but I wanted to take the opportunity to talk a little bit broader on electrification of transport and mobility as a whole, because there is, I think, here with the idea of what can we do to solve the challenges of transport, it's good to also rethink a little bit about mobility in general. So just giving a start, why we need to electrify transport, why is it important? I think it's probably not news for anyone, but I think we are very well aware that transport is a huge, if not the biggest, energy user in the UK. This is slightly old numbers, but the shares are more or less the same nowadays as well. So it's almost half of the pie, it's transport, and a big chunk of that, or the biggest chunk of that, is road transport. So, or buses, or cars, or taxis, or vans. Everything that is road transport is the biggest share of energy use. And that links, of course, to emissions as well. If we can see here, this is the transport emissions. Biggest chunk there is passenger cars and taxis. Of course, there is heavy good vehicles as well. There is vans, there's other elements. Aviation, of course, big emitter, but it's still not as big in consider relative speaking to passenger cars and taxis. So there is a big push there, a big need to electrify or decarbonize transport as a whole, but especially passenger cars and taxis. So we know what we need to do, but what can we actually electrify from these many options? And I guess the big challenge here is that we know that we cannot be plugged while we are moving. Trains can, but a specific case, but most other modes of transport we cannot plug. So what can we do? And I think the main problem here is the following. I'm not going to go into the very technical detail, but just thinking about energy density as a concept, because that tells us the story. We take this little graph, I think it's quite illustrative. You get petrol, gasoline as the point of reference. Everything to the right is it's better, basically, upper, and it's lighter in weight and is less uses less storage space. So everything here is good. Everything in red is bad, basically, because it requires more space to the same amount of energy, or is heavier for the same amount of energy. And you got, for example, diesel is similar in weight, but requires less space per unit of energy. Hydrogen, for example, is in the other end over here. It's lighter in weight, but requires more space than gasoline, for example, petrol. The problem here is batteries are very bad, relative to speaking, to gasoline here, which is really the big problem here, and that's why the reason of the big heavy batteries relative to what a small tank of gasoline could do, petrol. So how can we compete with these energy dense fuels like gasoline and diesel, for example? And I guess that's the benefit here. The trick on the sleeve for electricity is that it's more efficient. And this is a little graph here that is also quite illustrative. Gas, petrol, and diesel, anything that you burn will be considerably less efficient because most of the energy dissipates as heat. So you have petrol, diesel combustion engines. You use only 25% of your energy into actually moving the car. Most of it will be dissipated as heat. Fuel cell electric vehicles using hydrogen, but again, and with an electric engine, will be about 60%, and you use a battery electric vehicle, will be 70%. So it's about almost 3 times more efficient than a petrol diesel car. That is the benefit. Of course, again, energy density is worse, but because it's more efficient, it makes it competitive. Of course, there's the element of cost. This is a slightly older analysis. It was one of the first analysis of the type that shows you the cost of having an electric car over 4 years, including depreciation of the vehicle itself and the cost of the fuel in this case. And it was lower than the equivalents on petrol and diesel, for example, but also on hybrids. Hybrids they tend to be more expensive in the case because you still use other maintenance elements. You basically have 2 engines, so you have two bits of car within the same car that you need to maintain. But actually, we had an energy cost crisis. You may remember a couple of years ago, prices skyrocket, still high, not as high as before, but still pretty high relative to 2020, 2021. Does this change the balance? And I made this analysis, which is kind of the worst point we basically had. When the price cap in 2022, I don't know if you remember, it reached 51.8p. It was very expensive. The electricity was like the worst peak we had. And also one of the worst peaks we had was on petrol at that point in August 2022. It was almost 170 p's per liter. So very high prices at that point. So you compare the cost per mile on 2 very similar cars. I tried to get the most similar cars I could, and especially in the same make, the Skoda Enyaq and Skoda Karoq. It's pretty similar in size and everything. And the Enyaq gives you a range of 331 miles, sorry. Real miles, according to various places, is around 250 miles, so assuming a 72% efficiency. That times the cost of electricity divided by the number of miles, it gives you a 17.26p per mile. Same example for petrol. The rated miles per gallon, 46.3, but the actual more actually to be 40. 8.79 miles per liter, that gives you 19.32 p's per mile. So even in the worst situation, still slightly cheaper, the electric car. Not huge difference. Now, you might think, but actually, petrol is very cheap now. It cannot be the same. But actually, no, but also electricity is cheaper. So I'm updated it for this week, basically. Using the latest price cap 2024, or 24.5p per kilowatt hour. And the cost of petrol, I don't know how it's in Leeds, but here's about 130 something. So this is the average taken from the average across the UK. So using those new prices, we compare the example of the electric car with the 24.5 p's per kilowatt hour, you get 8.16p per mile. And for the petrol, it's 15.41p per mile. It's almost half the price, basically. And this is an important one. You can get specific tariffs for electric cars, for example, the ones that you have cheaper electricity overnight, whereas normally you would charge your car. My father-in-law, for example, he's laughing. He has an Enyaq. and he pays 7p per kilowatt hour. So that gives you about 2p's per 2.33p's per mile. So it's nothing. Like it's about what, 7 times cheaper? Well, 6 times cheaper than the petrol car. That makes sense, and it's a lot cheaper. And for lots of people, that is kind of the way to go. So what can we electrify? Going back to the general question, easier things to do, affordable, doable, these type of things. Cars, taxis, vans, they're not too heavy, they can be done. And again, the more you use them, the more the cheapness of that electricity will become apparent. And trains, of course, because you have the option of connecting on overhead lines. Harder to do, very heavy stuff that go over the sea, on the air. You need a lot of power for that. It's harder to do. Not impossible. There have been examples of people trying to do this, especially on the lorries. It's doable, but it's harder, it's more expensive, less convenient. The one in between is the buses. Actually, there have been lots of examples of electrification. Here in Glasgow, we have a few lines were fully electric, and they were very well, very quiet, very, very good buses. I'm not sure what's the state in Leeds on this, but I think more and more cities are taking on electrified buses. China, everything is electrified, for example. Most of the buses come from China, to be honest. But there is a good option there as well, because you can design your bus to do a particular route, and you know when you have your charging points and how often you need to charge. It's very set. So there is a lot of options there that you can design your system based on that. Lots of people always come to me and say, oh, but what about this and what about that? And I saw somewhere that said that EVs were the devil. So I always try to get some sort of facts on that. And I found this analysis done by the Carbon Brief. It's a very good think tank. They do a good analysis on various things around net zero technology and renewables, etc. And they did a good one about some of the main myths around EVs, and I picked some of the most famous ones, and hopefully you will recognize some of this, and hopefully will also give you some peace of mind. First one that people hear a lot is that EVs have to travel 50,000 plus miles to break even on carbon costs with a petrol or diesel. The analysis that's been developed with Tesla Model Y, which is not necessarily the most efficient or the better. You can have probably better numbers with a more efficient car, a smaller car. It's more like 13,000 miles. Of course, the original carbon cost of the batteries and everything on the electric vehicle is bigger than in a petrol or diesel car. You see the gray line here and the red line here to 0.0 basically. Yes, the manufacturing is spike, but because after that is a lot lower emissions, because there is no tailpipe emissions basically, and it's only what comes from the electricity production, is much more flat. Whereas the petrol diesel, it will stray up, and then the carbon debt is paid around the 13,000 miles. Lots of people will do 30,000 miles in a year, right? So in 1 year, maybe 2, you probably paid off your carbon emissions, and you will save over the lifetime quite a bit more. Linked to that, basically linked to that point, the EVs have little or no CO2 advantage over the car you already drive. And this was a point there from the Daily Express to say have a little or no advantage of that. But again, using that same analysis, if you look at the whole lifetime of 14 years assumed here, the EV will save about 30,000 tons of CO2. So it's a considerable amount of savings overall. The other option that people say, and that was famous, people may know Rowan Atkinson, Mr. Bean. He did a good, well, not good, interesting column on The Guardian, saying that it's better to keep your old banger rather than to get a new car, because, which is true, the carbon emissions on the existing car, they're already been done, so they need to do new emissions based on that. But still, it's not necessarily as good as you'd think. So the example here is you have a Ford Focus pre-2015, a Mercedes pre-2000, and you compare with a Nissan Leaf, which, as I mentioned, is a more efficient, a smaller car, and a Model Y. Yes, you have more emissions at the start, but then it gets flatter, whereas the other cars will keep emitting as you use them, and you basically are in this range. In around 32,000 miles 20 to 32,000 miles, you will pay off that debt. So again, thinking about doing about 10,000 miles per year, or a little bit around that number, maybe in 3-4 years, you will pay off the emissions. So I guess the message here is the only reason why an electric car will be worse in carbon emissions than an existing car or a different car, petrol car, is if you don't use it at all ever. Like if you're going to use it, there is no point to think that it won't be the case.
Christian, I'm just going to give you your 5-minute warning.
I need to hurry up then.
Sorry about that.
No worries. I'll finish with the debunking because I think that's probably relevant, and then I move on. Same about the electricity production. This is the average diesel car, average petrol car versus the average or the UK on emissions using the existing energy mix. So it's considerably lower. Even the worst case, Poland, is still lower than the petrol. Yeah, the cost, again, cheaper, we discussed that. The solutions, I'm gonna jump to the case of here because the problem with electric vehicles is that solve the emissions problem, but not necessarily does the most efficient thing. Why? Because you should, first of all, you need to try to do energy conservation. First way of conserving energy is not traveling. Can you avoid travel? Can you do a smart urban planning to don't need to travel as far, do remote working, etc.? And I have a little image on that. But if you must travel, then just thinking about reducing waste and mobility. One is don't get an SUV, huge cars, very expensive to run, not very efficient. It kind of gives you back any potential benefits on technology. It goes off the table because of the size of the car, basically. So big problem with SUVs. Don't go at one if you can't avoid it. There is the other element of land use, and there is this famous discussion of one more lane. Will that one more lane solve the issue? And it's not. It never solves the issue. It just creates more problems further down the line. And there are examples in the US and lots of places when they create bigger capacity on their motorways. The only thing that happens is alleviates the problem for a little bit, and it gets back worse again. And there is well-documented information there, and there's I give a few points there if anyone is interested to have a little bit look. So again, sustainability is more than energy use, and this is a good example, and I like this picture very much because it shows you what it takes to travel with, I don't know, 80 people, 100 people in a bus, and the land use and the land spacing it requires, versus if you have every single person in a car and you can compare the size of land required to do the same amount of mobility. So again, land use, more green spaces, we could use that for that. We could maybe use the space for a park, for a school, hospital, whatever you want. Accessibility, social justice, well-being. It brings all those questions into place that are bigger than just changing in a car for one type or the other type. So a good opportunity to rethink mobility, a good opportunity to realize that this is not necessarily the one-to-one solution. Best for mobility, if you ask me, public transport, of course, very important, but not necessarily the best. The best to me is active travel for those who can. Of course, not for everyone, but I think lots of people can travel in an active way. And the question is, how long is your commute? Most people travel less than 9 miles. 9 miles. And that is very doable with a car, with a bike, especially an electric bike. I don't know if anyone has the chance to use one. They're fantastic. Very easy, very powerful, go up hills, no problem at all. I think they're very good options there. Lots of cities in Europe use them, no problem. They commute, they go to the gym, they go shopping, they do everything all their life in a bike. And many people never ever own a car. So it's doable, it's possible. It's just a matter of changing your mindset on that sense. So yeah, why don't we cycle more? So just a few conclusions to finish because we're running out of time. Electrification of transport is a necessity. We need to do it. Cars and vans are straightforward candidates for this. I think that will be the main uptake. There is the question of hydrogen. That, unfortunately, I don't think will happen. There are uses for hydrogen. Is not this type of use. I think it's too expensive for that. It won't happen. The electrification race has been won. Of course, EVs can produce important economic benefits as well. didn't touch on that in detail, but I can pick it up later if anyone's interested. But again, the problem with EVs is that they're not the silver bullet. There is a one-to-one replacement to cars is not compatible with net zero. It's better to reduce or move away a little bit for that. And it will drive electricity cost up. The more electricity we demand, it will increase a little bit the cost. Not accessible for everyone. It still is expensive, and it creates the land use problem. So yeah, we have a great opportunity here to rethink mobility and think of, again, what we actually need and why. Can we do it any better? Can we reduce waste in energy, in materials, in land, and at the same time improve well-being for people? And I think I'm leaving at that. Yes, thank you very much. If we don't get to answer every question, please do drop me a line. I'm happy to pick up on anything via my email or anything. Yeah, thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much, Christian. That was really interesting. So yeah, I'd like to open the floor to any questions if anyone has any. Raise your hand or you can pop them in the chat, and I'll try and get to as many of you as possible. Jonathan, would you like to go? You just want to unmute yourself. There we go.
The presentation didn't mention hybrids, of which there's the self-contained ones and the plugins. And I think a lot of people, including our family, go for them because they're perceived to be greener, but also getting away from the problems in available plug-in networks and the cost of plug-in networks if you're traveling any distance from home, or where we live, you just can't plug the car in outside your house.
Yes, hybrids have evolved a lot recently. They are better now. The reason I didn't include them before is because most hybrids, the mild hybrids, the ones that are not plug-in, for example, they don't necessarily give you any savings. They end up being just as bad as a petrol diesel, because you have a little bit of electricity and a little bit of an engine, but at the same time you have the extra weight of the batteries or whatever extra engine you have. So you end up kind of just shifting things a little bit, but necessarily much better on the long. There is a role for them, I think, slowly, because as you probably are aware, ranges on electric batteries have improved massively in the last 5-10 years. And for that reason, lots of people are less concerned about range anxiety. And for that reason, lots of people are less kind of moved towards hybrid. There's still some people looking for it, but eventually I think it will go full electric in the long run. Not to say that they don't have a role today, but I think in the 5 years, 10 years, I think people will slowly move into EVs. There is a challenge, as you mentioned, and I think that's a very good point to mention. I unfortunately couldn't cover it because of the time. On the charging points, it's improving, but it's still slow, and it's very London-centric. You have lots of charging points in London, less so in other areas. There is a problem of off-street parking. People don't have access to charging at home. It's more expensive for them. So there are many things still to happen, that still need to happen, unfortunately. But those that have a drive that can charge at home, do it. Like, again, my father-in-law is laughing that he pays 2p per mile, whereas we have a petrol car, because we don't have any place to charge. We live in a flat, and we pay considerably more than that.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments? David, do you want to go?
Mute. Lord.
Hi.
Would you agree that it's important that if the government is intent on achieving its reduction in emissions, there should be far more incentive for people to swap from petrol and diesel cars to electric cars? Because one of the big problems is that many new cars, I think about 70-80% cars are bought on lease, a lot on the company cars, but at the moment there isn't much incentive for private buyers who typically keep their cars for more than 3 years, which is the typical lease period.
That's a good question. There have been quite a bit of subsidies, like as you may remember, there were lots of grants for electric cars. There is a tax benefits as well that you still get. It has slowed down that because the market is picking up. If you look at new sales of cars in the UK and everywhere, the percentage of new cars that are sold electric increases every year, and I think I need to double check that, so don't quote me on that. In many countries, the share of new electric cars being bought is bigger than the petrol and diesel counterpart. So is the bigger kind of segment growing, which suggests that the market is picking up and the market itself is driving that. So I think that's the reason why people are kind of standing down a little bit on the incentives. You have the problem as well that those incentives tend to be very regressive. Basically, those that can afford, those that have the means, are the ones that get in the incentive, and that incentive comes from your taxes. So those people that don't get a car and will never own a car are paying for me to get a grant, which is not great. Of course, there is a point for this. You need to incentivize the market, etc., etc. So yes, I think the incentive needs to be the right one, but you need to be careful not to basically subsidize the rich in that sense. So I think as the economics of it are there because of the reason I mentioned. It's a lot cheaper to run, it's a lot cheaper to maintain, it's a lot cheaper to keep. So I think people slowly will start realizing, well, actually, I pay the same money for getting a new BMW diesel versus a Tesla. I might as well get the Tesla because it's cheaper to run. So I think that will be the idea. And eventually it will do it by itself without the need of subsidies. If you want to do it quicker, yes, subsidies, of course, and benefits from that sense. But the economics are in favor of electric cars at the moment. Hopefully that answers the question.
Lord.
Or do you want to go next?
Yeah. On the longer term, I was very interested by the fact that you forecast this for 14 years, which kind of ticks my boxes, as in it's not the kind of thing that you expect to replace every 5 years. Is there any design attempt at employing recycling materials, putting the old cars on top of an electric engine?
That's a very good question. And 2 points there. The first point that we are very wasteful as a society. It doesn't matter if it's electric car or petrol, diesel. The idea of changing your car every 3 years is silly, really. Well, apologies if anyone does that every year, every 2-3 years. But I see lots of people with getting new leases and then just changing their cars every 2-3 years. That is wasteful because at the end of the day, the car is perfectly fine and could go for a lot longer. So buying a new car just incentivizes that idea of creating more and more and more and more and more. And cars end up in the waste field for, I don't know, after 6-8 years, something like that. So it's very wasteful. If you could think like earlier on, like in the 80s, 90s, people kept their cars for much longer than what we do today. So that's one point. But the actual element on the recycling and kind of using old cars to get new engines, I haven't done it myself. I remember seeing an analysis on that, and it says that it's not a lot of savings on carbon emissions on doing it, because the retrofit itself might, like the batteries, you still need to add the batteries, which is the big carbon component here, the engine, etc., etc. So there might be a bit of a benefit, but it might not be huge, unfortunately, on that end. The element of recycling stuff, I think that's a very valid point. I don't think manufacturers have deal with that yet, at least not comprehensively, I don't think, because at the end of the day, something that you don't recycle is a lot cheaper. So that's the reason people don't really care about. It will need to pick up because of the finite materials, as we all know, but I don't think there is a big regulation for car manufacturers to do it, and you need to have it, otherwise it won't happen.
Does anyone else have a question? Hugh, is that a hand up I see? Go for it.
Yeah, it is. Is anybody doing any work on battery exchange and battery hire? in electric vehicles as a way forward to get around the problem of the exceptional expense of vehicles, electric vehicles?
That's a good question. Not I'm aware here in the UK. I don't think there are any firm plans. Where I have seen that happening is in China, and I've seen reports of people doing taxi drivers that they do the battery switch. Like certain cars are designed for that. Instead of charging, they just switch their batteries basically, and they take, I don't know how long it takes.
3 minutes.
Sure. Pardon?
2 to 3 minutes.
Yeah. I guess you can say, well, if you charge with a fast charger, you will get it in 20. Is that a huge saving in time? For a taxi driver, maybe it is. I think for the general public, maybe not huge, but it's an option there, definitely. I think the other element is like, what happens when your batteries died in your car and you need to replace them? Most manufacturers will allow to do that. I don't think how easy or how cheap it is. But the point also to highlight, and I've seen analysis and research on this, is that people think that the batteries died after 7 years, and that's kind of their lifetime, and then you need to replace them. But the reality is you have Nissan Leafs, the first generation ones, that are maybe 15 years old now, and they're still going, no problem. What happens is not that the batteries died, is that they're just not as effective or they don't perform as well as they did. Like you can think about your phones. Your phone, when it's new, it has, I don't know, it lasts 4 days without a charge, right? When it's a year old or 2 years old, maybe it won't last 4 days, it will only last 2 days. So it's kind of the same idea that battery charging is just not as, they don't perform as well, but they're still going and they're still fine. So in the case of the Leafs, instead of giving you, I don't know, the old ones that didn't have a huge range, 100 miles, they might give you 70 now. But for a lot of people, that's plenty. If you're only doing a school run and you're going to commute to work and back, that's plenty to do it every day. And some people just keep going and just keep them. So I don't think lots of people actually recycle the batteries. I think it's just easier when you run out 15 years and you want to replace your car. That's when you do it instead of getting a new battery set in the middle. Hope that answers the question.
I think we've got time for one more. So Roderick, do you want to go?
Yeah, hello. Are you saying that all the money spent on research into using hydrogen as a fuel is really a waste of money because they were right down the bottom left-hand corner of your graph?
For cars
Yeah.
and vans, I don't see much happening. And the only people that still push for hydrogen is the Japanese. Toyota and Honda had a hydrogen version of their cars. But the problem is not, the main problem here is hydrogen is too expensive to make. It's too expensive to make and it's very inefficient to make. The thing is, and just on that point briefly, if you want to do hydrogen in a clean way, like meaning without emissions, and if not, what's the purpose of making it in the first place? You use electricity. So you put it via an electrolyzer, you need water. That will have an efficiency about 60-70%, and then you get the hydrogen. You need to store it, you need to compress it, normally a very high level of compression. Otherwise, it's very fugitive, it's very easy to leak. So you need to compress it a lot, potentially even liquefy it, which means cold temperatures as well. All that costs energy. And then you put it in your, if you burn it, it's worse because you have all the heat waste. If you use it in a fuel cell, basically what you're doing is you're moving an electric engine. So you're losing it for electricity to hydrogen, to storing, to put it into a fuel cell, to actually transform it into electricity again. Do you see my point?
Yeah.
You got electricity first and you have electricity at the end. Everything in between is waste. So for every unit of electricity you could use directly into the car, you basically get only a fraction of it into your final hydrogen thing. Having said all that, there is a role for it in shipping, in ferries, in potentially in aviation. Why? Because you don't have a good substitute for that. Does that make sense?
Yep.
that's the reason. It's physics.
Yeah.
It's the economics and the physics of it.
Great. Well, I think that's all we have time for today, I'm afraid. But thank you so much for your questions, and a huge thank you to Christian for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for everyone's engagement. We'll be hosting a further 2 webinars in this kind of mini series, and you can find out details of those and where to register on the most recent Leeds Civic Trust newsletter. But yeah, until next time, have a lovely evening, and see some of you at the planning committee. Okay. Bye.